I just started doing it a couple of hours a week. And then the people at the station graciously said, well, you can have some more time off to go do that. So I managed to get in 2 or 3 sessions a week. And now I'm able to go every day pretty much. And it's been forever.
The voice is so familiar.
The big change has been in the recording process. We used to be recording on pure audio tape. And now we're recording a digital file.
We've listened for so many years. Decades, with so many changes.
I pretty much always cold read. That's my dirty little secret.
And so many different genres.
It was an erotic novel written in first person by Belinda.
Up close and personal.
Introducing Belinda. Well, first off, this is no sob story about mother. I am not ready to lie down on a shrink's couch and say this was all.
I'm doing an entire book as a woman in an erotic novel. That was weird.
Doing what comes so naturally.
I know a lot of people who would not step into the studio and start recording even the first page without having read the whole book in advance. I'm not that guy.
And now please join Jeff Thompson and me and our guest, Ray Foushee.
That's my dirty little secret.
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson.
And I'm Pete Lane. Our guest today is Ray Foushee. Ray is most commonly known to all of us as a talking book narrator for the American Printing House. Ray has read more than 1,000 books since 1983 when he started reading and is currently retired. Ray's voice will be very familiar to all of us. How are you doing this morning, Ray?
I am doing fine. How about you?
I'm just wonderful. When did you retire exactly?
I retired on January 12th, 2018. It's only famous with me, but I just passed my 4-year anniversary, and it seems like it was more like about 4 months. It really goes by fast. I can warn anybody out there who's rapidly approaching retirement is that your years really start flying by after that happens.
Absolutely, they do. I've been retired since 2015, and time has literally flown.
Yes.
So, Jeffrey, how are you doing today?
Well, time goes by when you're having fun. So, Ray, you must have enjoyed it.
I've been enjoying retirement greatly. One of the big reasons is that it really allows me a little bit more time and flexibility to do more of my recording, which I did not retire from, and I really get a kick out of doing.
What got you interested and started in reading audiobooks?
It's really funny. It was a completely random occurrence that had me meeting the guy who introduced me to it. Where I worked for 40 years was WGRB-TV, which is the Fox affiliate here in Louisville, Kentucky, where I lived all my life. I was an announcer. I was also a copywriter. This is back 40 years ago, so I was actually a young man then. And I would prepare copy for an older gentleman who just freelanced for the station, but he'd come in on Fridays and record our weekend copy that would air over our movies and things like that. His name is Jerry Fordyce. Jerry Fordyce, as it turns out, had been and was still at that time a narrator for the American Printing House for the Blind, which is where I record my books. I happened to be talking with him one day, and he made mention of, well, I hope I can get out of here soon enough because I have a reading session at the Printing House for the Blind. Well, I'd never heard of the Printing House for the Blind, and I thought, reading session, what is that? And so I asked him, what is it you do? And he told me, I've been doing this for years. We record books for the blind, and it's just a few miles from here. I thought, that's an interesting thing to find out about. And then he said, why not pick up a few extra dollars along the way? It's not a whole lot, but I thought, extra dollars? I'm a young guy. I've got a little daughter on the way. I thought, extra dollars. And he's right. You don't get rich. I said, tell me more about this. And he told me, and I had been doing some announcing at the station anyway. And I thought, I had some vocal chops. It actually worked out. They sent my tapes to the Library of Congress. They said, yeah, fine. And so I just started doing it a couple of hours a week. And then the people at the station graciously said, well, you can have some more time off to go do that. So I managed to get in 2 or 3 sessions a week. And now I'm able to go every day pretty much during the week. And it's been forever. But that's how I found out about it. That's how I got into it.
And that was in 1983, 1982, somewhere thereabout?
I'm thinking 82, late 82, I believe. I remember the first book. It was a Western, of which I have done many since then. The title was Sam Bass. I'll never forget that. That was my first book. But since then, there have now been over 1,000 that I've done.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's great. So was that cassette tape days or was that still flexible disc?
That was cassette days.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as far as what we were recording on, of course, we weren't recording on cassettes. It was big reel-to-reels. Yeah, the final product was cassettes because I remember the closing announcements on each side would be end of side 6, turn the cassette over and switch. Yeah, the consumers were definitely listening to cassettes.
Yeah, for sure.
9710. The Motive, a Dismas Hardy mystery by John Lesquois. Read by Ray Foushee. Library of Congress annotation. Former homicide cop Abe Glitz is Miss Hardy's high school girlfriend. Strong language and some violence. 2000.
I have to tell you, Ray, I am in the midst of John Lesquois.
Ah, one of my favorites.
Definitely one of mine. I have an affinity for legal fiction. I read one of his first books. I've said, this is definitely up my alley.
Yeah, they're fun. I got to meet him.
Did you really?
Out in Los Angeles, I was invited out there by a group to get an award. They had other guests. One was Lindsay Wagner. Apparently, she was a big benefactor of theirs. They invited a narrator, me, and an author, and it happened to be Lesquois.
How about that?
That was fun. At that time, that was back in 2009. I was actually in the middle of doing a lot of his books. We got along really well.
Yeah, he's got quite a few of them in the Dismas Hardy series.
Yeah, they're fun.
They really are.
Did you know Dismas Hardy is the nephew of the Hardy Boys?
I did not.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to him about this. In one of the books, Dismas is reflecting back on his youth, and he's thinking about his mother, his parents in general, and his father's name is Joe. Okay, big deal. But then he mentions his mother and just one time calls her by name, and her name is Iola. And in the old Hardy Boys books, Joe Hardy's girlfriend was Iola Morton. And I thought, this can't be a coincidence. And I asked him about that, and he said, that's great. You picked up on that. There's very few people do that.
That's cool.
It's actually, he's Frank Hardy's nephew and Joe Hardy's son, which makes the Dismas Hardy books a whole lot more fun to me because I grew up reading the Hardy Boys. That was really cool.
Oh, wow. What a connection. Have you ever done any Clive Cussler?
I have done, I know I did one. It was a while back. I couldn't begin to tell you what the title was. It's amazing how the titles of these books, well, I've done over 1,000 now. A lot of times they just disappear into the mist, and especially if it's a really forgettable book in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And now things have changed a whole lot because up until about 2 years ago, we were recording things that actually, were recorded on audio tape, and we recorded them in sides. There would actually be a side of a tape. It was 90 minutes long. And when you were finished, you began the next side and you reintroduced the book. You do the introduction of side 2, such and such so-and-so by such and such so-and-so, continuing on page 72 or whatever.
Double Deuce by Robert B. Parker. Copyright 1992 by Robert B. Parker. Narrated by Ray Foushee. This book contains 224 pages on 5 sides.
But now that we do things digitally, we actually still do record in 90-minute hunks, but that's just for the convenience. You don't want to get 10 hours into a book and then have a corrupted file that blows the whole book and you have to go back and fix it.
Mm-hmm.
This way, it breaks it down into separate files and makes the possibility of mayhem a whole lot less. But anyway, I find now in the last couple of years, unless it's a book that I really, really liked and paid attention to, I may completely forget, even while I'm doing the book, what the title of it is, because I say it once. That's it, until the end of the book.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas before, if it was a 12-sided book, I would have said that name so many times it's burned into my brain. So it's funny, how I can completely remember a book and have no idea, no recollection at all what the title was.
I find that with editing, when I do something where I have a few speakers and I edit it all the way through, then I get the transcript and I can almost pinpoint exactly where it is in the 45-minute to an hour post because I've lived it so many times.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Burned it into my brain, like you said.
Yeah. Back and forth. Sure, it's going to be there forever.
You've obviously seen quite a bit of technology over the years. How has it changed from that point in time, the early 80s, until now, for example? What do you use for technology? Do you still read a hard print book, by the way?
I do not, but that's a very recent occurrence. I now read off of a computer screen. It's an ebook, but that just started maybe about 2 years ago at most, at least at the printing house. I'm sure maybe other places introduced the technology a little bit earlier. Right. I'm not sure. But up until then, I was working with the actual printed book. But the big change has been in the recording process, which of course I don't touch. I'm just talking into a microphone. But what I'm talking into and where it's going is very different because we used to be recording on pure audio tape. Mm-hmm. And now we're recording a digital file. You would think it wouldn't make much difference to me, But boy, does it when you're talking about doing corrections or just trying to go back and find something, because everything in a digital file, if somebody's noted a correction, they note the precise point where it is. In the old days, when you're doing corrections, you had to go whizzing through a 90-minute tape and just kind of approximate where you're going to find it, go back and forth and back and forth. And then the cut-in process, if you have to replace a sentence, I can just record that sentence and it can be dropped in and replaced, digital magic. Whereas before we actually had to find that spot, and then I had to cut in at exactly the right spot, do my correction. If it was a 7-second long sentence, then I would have to make sure my sentence was exactly the same, replacing it. I no longer have to worry about any of that. And that whole process is much smoother for me. Quality is much better too.
Ray, what are your favorite genres? And was there any genre that just made you cringe?
I can give you the best example of the latter. Early on, this would have been at least certainly in my first 3 or 4 years. For some reason, I was assigned a book by Anne Rice. And this was before Anne Rice was Anne Rice. I mean, I get this book and I have no idea who this Anne Rice is. And I don't think anybody else would have either. It was prior to her really hitting it big. But it was a book called Belinda was the title of it. I'll never forget this. And it was an erotic novel written in first person by Belinda, the title character. That was weird. The whole thing, I'm doing an entire book as a woman in an erotic novel.
Belinda, a novel. Copyright 1986 by Anne Rice, writing as Anne Rambling. Narrated by Ray Foushee. Annotation. Chronicles the sexual obsession of a middle-aged author. He is captivated by a 16-year-old runaway. Strong language and explicit descriptions of sex. 1986. Part 2. Introducing Belinda. Well, first off, this is no sob story about mother. I am not ready to lie down on a shrink's couch and say this was all.
To this day, I cringe at the thought of going back and listening to it. But at the same time, I think I'd love to go back and listen to it just to find out how ridiculously stupid that was. That made me kind of cringe, but I think it also proved to the people at the printing house that I was versatile, that I would do anything. Because if I do that, I guess I'd do anything. So that's been lucky. I've generally always had a book assigned to me as opposed to them waiting around saying, well, we haven't found quite the right book for you to do, so you take the week off or whatever. They usually find the right book for me to do because I can do a whole lot of different ones. But as far as my favorite, man, do I love hard-boiled crime stories. I think they're really, really fun to do. I really like true crime stories. Those are pretty fascinating. I got to do, for instance, Helter Skelter, which is a fine, fine book.
Helter Skelter is a good book.
I'd read it myself many years ago, long before I became a narrator. So I was ready to go with that one. But I do a wide array, and I tend to enjoy pretty much any of the things I do. Reading of the Green Mile, which I think is one of the finest books done, and I really, really enjoyed that.
The Green Mile. So, with Stephen King, you got to strap on your boots because you're in for the long haul because his books are long, aren't they?
They definitely are. Although that's not tremendously long, at least not by Stephen King standards. It was released originally when it was published as a series of paperback books. He wanted to emulate what Charles Dickens had done with his stories.
6 parts, wasn't it?
It was 6 parts, and they came out monthly in paperback. That was the original, and I just swallowed those up eagerly as they came out because, like I say, I was already a Stephen King fan, whether I was narrating his stuff or not. I just thought that was really good. Those were very tiny paperbacks. They were about 90 pages long. 6 of those, that's not a really long
Not for Stephen King
book. You can go a lot longer, right?
That's true. I read The Stand 3 times, and that's 1,000 or 1,100.
Right. And there's a longer version of it, I think, too, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly.
When it first came out, it was the 1,100. Then since then, they've released an unabridged copy that he was the one who did the abridging on in the first place.
I know we touched on this a bit earlier, Ray, but you've not done any commercial audiobook reading. All of your reading has been for APH?
That's correct. I haven't done any Audible or any stuff like that.
Have you been tempted?
Well, not really, although I would be if I suddenly couldn't do work for APH anymore, because I'd want to continue doing it. But I'm happy doing as much as I do and for what I do it for at APH, and I'm not looking to go anywhere else.
Right.
So, Ray, do you do a cold read or do you prep for characters or a particular book?
That's my dirty little secret, although I'll share it. I pretty much always cold read. I don't do a whole lot of read ahead. I mean, I will on some things that obviously require, some familiarity with what's going to be a very convoluted story or whatever like that. But so many books, as I said before about legal thrillers and hard-boiled crime stories, they follow such a pattern that you can go cold and pretty well know where things are going. I know a lot of people who, would not step into the studio and start recording even the first page without having read the whole book in advance. And I'm not that guy. I think maybe it began as being simply lazy. But it's really developed almost for me into a deliberate strategy, because I have found on occasion when I have read a big segment of a book long before I go in and read it, I don't think I read it as well. Because I think a big part of the reading process, and I'm not talking about the narrating process, I'm talking about the reading process. Anybody who's just sitting down with a book and reading it, is they're getting it for the first time. And that's part of the way it goes. You don't know as the reader what's going to happen next. So it's almost unfair for the narrator to kind of communicate that he does know what's coming next. You know what I mean?
So if there's a dialogue between a guy and a gal, do you change it up at all on the fly?
I do. But that's one of the things that, they definitely are looking for, somebody who can do that, but not sound, caricaturish. I don't want to talk like this, like a girl. Right. But some people actually try to do that. I find that, if it's just a typical man-woman conversation, it's very simple for me to be the man like this and for the woman to speak a little bit like this in an upper register. That's still my voice. If I just used this upper register all day, I don't think people would think I was trying to imitate a woman. But compared to my voice down here, which is my normal voice, then it's a man-woman. I think that conveys the difference right there.
Well, Ray, what baffles me is how well you do different male voices. You might have a conversation with 2 females and 3 males. To use Dismas Hardy as an example, you do a distinctively identifiable voice for Diz Hardy, which is differentiable from Abe Glitsky, for example. How do you
Abe's
know?
got a deep voice like this.
Yeah.
I'll give it a little bit of difference in registers there, too. Dismas versus Abe is Dismas being me, and Abe not being a little higher register, but a little lower register like that.
So how do you know which one to use without even having read the dialogue?
Well, in a case of like Dismas and Abe, all I had to do was read the very first chapter of the very first book, and I knew who they were, and I could file that away. Now, you do bring up an interesting thing. When I do encounter characters for the very first time, I will very often do the dialogue for the first page or 2, and then realize, wait, this isn't working. I don't have them right. And we'll go back and start again. That's okay. But it usually doesn't take much longer than that to do it. I mean, now, here's the thing that does screw you up, and I'd invite your input on this too, because we talk about this all the time. In a book, let's say there's a very suspenseful moment, and a character is awakened by the phone ringing. He picks up the phone, and the book goes, a voice on the other end said, "Hello, I saw you, and I will get you." Click. The end of the chapter. We're going to move on to the next thing now. Am I supposed to give away who that voice is? Because later in the book, it may turn out to be one of the male characters. It may turn out to be one of the female characters. But the reader, as they get to that spot, they don't know. Right. They're not supposed to know yet.
It was the butler.
I have to give it a voice. So the only thing I can do there is give it the most neutral voice I can. I almost do it as
a generic.
But it's still going to be either male or female. But I try not to do anything to give it a deep voice or a high voice or anything like that.
And that's all split-second thinking, just on the fly.
Yes. Yeah. At that point, yeah. When you realize there's going to be nothing here that's going to identify who this is. And the whole point of this plot twist is that you're not supposed to know. That's going to be part of the mystery. It's a weird thing that most people, when they're just reading a book, would never think about twice.
True, because it's in their mind. Right.
Exactly.
Although I think as readers, we also try to assign a voice or some sort of an identity in some way to characters. And I don't know why it would be much different in that situation.
Sure. Exactly. That's all true. And, when I am doing any kind of a novel, immediately you can count on the fact that the main male character, the main male protagonist, is going to be me. It's going to be my natural voice, because that's who I'm going to be most of the time. So that's comfortable. And we work from there. Women get a little bit higher register. Guys from Brooklyn get a little bit of this. You don't want to do a broad thing, but you want to be a little bit less formal, maybe give it the nose. Gravelly voices are really easier to do too. They say gravelly. It's, it works.
Ray, I've known a lot of listeners who like following authors. They like following series, but some of them follow Ray. Mm-hmm. They like how they read books, so they look up the narrator.
Right. I've met people like that who told me they look for mine. I don't think I'm the only one they look for, but yeah, they have their favorites, and that's who they want to hear. And it really is secondary what we're reading, which is a really nice thing to think about. I mean, it's quite a compliment, but I don't think it's unusual.
I think I'm that way to a great extent. I think the narrator, the reader, can make or break the story. In fact, I've picked up a book, the ones we've been constantly talking about, and I apologize to the audience for harping on this one author. But if it's not a Ray Foushee reading it, or perhaps another reader, but if it's certain readers, I will set it aside. And I love the series.
I'm the guy who's reading them into the microphones. I rarely hear any of the books by my colleague or myself, for that matter, once they're done. So, I've got a lot of people that I narrate with. I know them well, speak to them every day. I know what their voices sound like, but I don't know what their voices sound like in a recording. And that can be different, I think. I just know that I've heard from many, many people who say, oh, I love this particular narrator. And I'll listen to anything he or she does. I've heard people say that about me, too. It's kind of fun to be recognized that way.
How are you assigned books? For instance, you read this John Lesquat series. Do you always get those when they come up, or do they assign them to other readers?
I haven't gotten a Lesquat in a long time. First of all, the Library of Congress, National Library Service, which is a part of the Library of Congress, they're the ones who decide which books are going to be sent to which recording houses. And there are only a few recording houses they deal with in the nation. But in any case, that's the first step, is that their committee picks books that they want to have recorded. They send the shipment on a regular, like weekly, biweekly basis to those houses. And then it's up to the recording houses to assign the books based on who they have available and who they think, can do things. Generally, there's always an attempt. If the books come through and there's a follow-up in a series and you've done earlier books in the series, you'll get it. That's pretty much the case, unless you did the first book in the series and nobody thought you did a good job, in which case that's not going to be the case. But if you're really associated with a series book, you're going to get it. But as far as how they assign things that aren't series books, which is the vast majority of them, it's just the question of our studio head, and she does a great job, basically assigning the books based on her perceptions of how it's going to go. She scans the books, figures out what the genre is, and figures out what this is going to take. Certain things are going to make a book a woman's book or a man's book, except in the case of that crazy Anne Rice book.
Well, first off, this is no sob story about Mother. I am not ready to lie down on a shrink's couch and say this was all bad.
Normally, there are certain standards, but that was years and years ago. If there's a nonfiction book, for instance, I did one recently. It was called An American Hero. It's a very good book, by the way. It was a book that was about a guy who spent 5 years in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. Had an incredible military career before that and after that. An amazing tale. I got that book, and I think I'll get a book like that for many reasons. I do a lot of American history books, so I'm pretty good on places, history like Vietnam. I'm old enough to remember Vietnam and more naturally pronounce Vietnamese place names because they were commonplace in the news back then. Whereas, there might be another nonfiction book that deals with a different subject that possibly I wouldn't necessarily be connected with. And then she'll find somebody else who would do a better job on that. But that's it. And Westerns, like I say, hard-boiled crime, it's almost an automatic that goes into my pocket.
I would imagine commercial recordings also change what you're handed, with so much more now coming down the line in commercially recorded.
Absolutely. And what it does is it reduces what we're handed. We don't do nearly as many books at the printing house now as we did 40 years ago when I started there, because 40 years ago, there was no commercial book market. 20 years ago, there was, and you saw a difference then. But even then, there was a definite difference in the product because virtually all commercial books were so heavily abridged that you had people split into camps. You had the people who, that was okay with them. And then you had the diehards who, no, they weren't going to listen to an abridged product. They wanted to hear every word. But now there's a whole lot of audio on the market that isn't abridged, and it's a real competition there. You just naturally don't necessarily get as many books as you did. On the other hand, though, we always have done books that are also available on the shelves as a commercial book. Green Mile would be one of them. You could go to any, good bookstore that handles audiobooks, and I'm sure you could find an unabridged reading of the Green Mile, and it won't be me. But it's a definitely different thing. There are fewer narrators now. It's like so many other endeavors in America today. It's smaller. We've had to adapt. We don't have as much business. But the ones of us who are still there probably read as much as we would have in the old system. It's just there would have been a whole lot more readers to do a whole lot more product.
Do you listen to audiobooks yourself when you read?
I have only listened to one audiobook in my life from beginning to end, and that was a recording of Dracula, a book I read when I was maybe 13 years old and fell in love with. I do like to listen to podcasts, laying in bed at night especially. I'm used to the idea of wanting to listen to voices, but books themselves, no. But I found out about the existence of this Dracula that was out there, so I made an attempt to do that, and I found it to be a very pleasant experience.
Ray, with the technology that is out today, we're starting to hear some artificial intelligence voice engines reading books and reading text and stuff like that.
Right.
And I see it in audio description on TV shows. How do you view that? I know you said there's not as much opportunity, but are there younger people getting involved as well?
Yes. Yeah, we have several younger people at the printing house who are doing some work. Of course, to me now, everybody's a younger person, but I'm realizing now some of the examples I was going to tell you about that. I thought, no, she's 50. But no, there are some very young people who are there. Not many at all, but they're doing it. You mentioned the automated voices, the artificial intelligence voices. I haven't had hardly any experience listening to those, but I can't imagine that they'd be tolerable to me. And I find that readers that I hear from, people who do contact me and like to talk about the books I do, they are adamantly against it. They hate it. There is a large cadre of readers out there who want nothing to do with the artificial voice. And unless it's a lot better than I imagine it is, I would have to agree. I can't imagine thinking an artificial voice is going to be better than a human voice.
Well, I listen to voiceover all the time, and I cannot listen to an entire book. I can go on the BARD or I can go on to certain things and listen to voiceover reading something, but it's usually more of an educational thing. I want some information. I gather that information. But if I want to sit down and settle into a book and get lost in that world that's being read to me, I want a human voice, inflection, just it's all there.
I won't say that I don't think an artificial voice could capture all of that, because if I said that about every technology that ever came along, I'd look like the most foolish person in the world, because sooner or later, everybody does get it right. And boy, you can't believe that artificial intelligence does this. But right now, I would have to be convinced. And I don't think the technology is certainly there at all. There's such a wide range of inflection, some of which may be unique. Seriously, you may give a word a certain inflection that has never been done before. It's very possible when you're just a human being reading a word. Artificial intelligence, by its very nature, can't do that.
Well, that's pretty open-minded thinking, and I would agree with you, because just looking at the quality of the digital voices today versus even 5-10 years ago, it's phenomenal, the difference. And where we'll be in a year or two, it may have an appeal to us that we just can't even fathom at this point in time.
Well, that's right. It really isn't related, but at the same time it is. I mean, when I was a kid, what did we think was the most expensive looking, perfect, beautiful television picture you could imagine? Somebody got the most expensive set, biggest screen you could get. It was a black and white picture of lines across the screen that looks totally primitive now next to what we have now. But then, to our eyes, it looked perfect, and we were amazed.
19-inch.
Sure,
that's right.
A 19-inch. If you paid, say, $700-800 for a TV back then, boy, you were getting the very best thing you could get. And I am sure to the eyes of 1955, 1957, these people were as dazzled as, you are now when you walk into Costco and see their big 4K and Ultra K screens there. That no comparison, but yet it looked like that to them then.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight from New York, the Ed Sullivan Show. Thank you very much.
Yesterday was the 58th anniversary of the Beatles' first appearance on Ed Sullivan.
I knew it well.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Glued to a 17-inch TV. Might have even been black and white.
You bet it was.
Yeah.
It was black and white. Everything was black. Well, not everything wasn't in 64, but the Ed Sullivan Show sure was still.
Yeah.
I also think, whatever the picture was, it was awesome. I mean, when the astronauts landed on the moon, we didn't complain about the microphone they used.
True.
No.
It was information. You got it, and it was just amazing.
Now when you hear transmissions from outer space, these guys sound like they're in the next room. There's no difference in listening to that audio quality than it is listening to me sitting next to you. And the video, one of my hobbies is I like to go back through old newspaper archives and just kind of pick a random date and, just see what the newspaper looked like that day. Movie ads, TV schedules, what was going on in the news. Just the other day, I was looking at a story that it was probably a week after the moon landing. And it was written by the local TV writer at the time. And the big headline was about the company that we can thank for the wonderfully sharp, clear pictures we got from the moon. And I was thinking, boy, that was called a sharp, clear picture. But it was by our standards then. Time does march on, doesn't it?
It does.
Other than the tape hiss from cassettes that we all endured, but we didn't pay much attention to it because when I was listening to the tapes, I was going to school. I was just taking information. So that didn't particularly bother me at all. But nowadays, with all the digital and the ease of being able to, like you said, edit or whatever you do with the audio tracks, today it matters a little bit more. I think people want to hear that good narrator. They want to hear it because we've been spoiled a little bit. The availability of it is all that. So I don't want to see it go away.
I agree. I know what you mean.
Is there a word that is a stumper for you to articulate a little
No
bit?
one, but there are word combinations that will mess you up. Words that maybe end in an SCH sound, but then begin with an SCH sound, the next word. That'd be an extreme example. But there are words like that where you almost have to stop after each word, even in a little 3-word phrase, because you can't move your mouth around that fast. You realize when you do say it out loud that if you're doing it as dialogue in a book, that author in this instance does not have a good ear for dialogue, because you realize you're not the only person who can't do this. You realize no humans ever say those 3 words together, It's just an epiphany you have. Now, if it's as part of the straight narration of the author's voice, that's okay, because when you write the words you want. But you realize that nobody really talks this way. That's a big difference between books I enjoy doing and books I don't enjoy doing, because you never realize it when you're just sitting, looking at a book and reading it, as a sighted person. But that happens a whole lot. And some authors don't have a talent at all for understanding how people talk. And so many of those examples will come up that when you're actually saying it out loud, you realize nobody ever says this. And you have a book like that, and you're always kind of on guard whenever dialogue begins, because he's going to trip you up here. Whereas you have other authors, and I'm not saying they make it simpler, but they have an ear for dialogue where it, quotes when you get to a long conversation. Everything everybody says floats very naturally off your tongue. And you suddenly realize this guy knows how to write dialogue.
I noticed that during editing, if a word ends with a S and starts with a S, if someone's minced a word and I want to correct it, just to find the word a, like in a cat, or something like that, I'd be better off going to get cat and pulling it out of there, because everyone always blends it right together with the next word, or they tail off a word and blend it into the next word.
Right. And that's not necessarily wrong. If it's dialogue, that's the way you do it. A good example of a phrase like a census statistics.
Yeah.
A
lot of them in there.
It's not easy to rattle off census statistics,
Do you ever do voice exercises to kind of loosen up the jaw or the tongue before you sit down to read?
No, not really. It's more important that I not do certain things. I tend to not want to read right after a meal. So I like to do my reading late morning. Generally, my sessions are like from about 10:30 to 12:30. So it's more like what I don't want to do before I read as opposed to anything I do.
That's exactly me. I'm a morning guy. I like before noon. I do a late night show every 2 weeks. It's a different voice. My voice is all creamy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's a certain phlegmy quality at certain times of the day, which isn't necessarily negative, but it's different than what you do most of the time. It's almost in the back of your throat. When we do corrections, many, many times corrections will come around and I usually match perfectly. It's amazing. It really is incredible to me that my voice will sound exactly the same as it did when I recorded the original maybe a month ago. But I will immediately recognize, oh yeah, this was the day I was reading in the afternoon. When I do the correction, I try to manufacture that quality in my voice to match that.
I do that a lot. If I record it at night and also I'm editing in the morning, I cannot throw in my deep morning voice. I gotta step back for a second and think about it.
Right.
You're imitating yourself. Yes.
Ray, I know you haven't done any commercial recording, but what kind of advice would you think of giving someone who wanted to get into the voiceover or audio describer or narrator/reader business, a young kid getting into that kind of a thing?
Boy, that's hard, because I certainly just stumbled into the whole thing. When I tell you I worked at a TV station for 40 years, even that was an accident. I did not do anything in my education. I didn't do anything in the first 7 years of my employed life that had anything to do with using my voice for anything at all. I was working for state government. The only thing I was doing was writing a freelance column for the local newspaper about old television. And just suffice it to say that that led to one thing, led to another thing, led to another thing, wound up me getting a job as promotion manager, not as anything else, at the TV station that I wound up staying with for the rest of my life. Once I'm there, they heard my voice, got me to do a few, announcing strips, tags for commercials or stuff. I got to know my way around an audio booth, and then I became the station announcer in addition to what I was doing, and wound up over at the printing house. What I would do would be to tell them if they can find anybody who does it. Now, I'm talking about commercial, because I don't think there's going to be a huge long-term future for the reasons we've discussed before. I have a good friend of mine who does stuff for Audible, who is also a narrator at the printing house. I'm sure she'd be a font of information because she got the gig at the printing house through me. I'm the one who recommended her. We worked together at the station. So somewhere between then and now, she went and did the research and found out about it. Right now, if I wanted to do that, she'd be the first person I go to and say, hey, what did you do? How did this work out? But I don't know. I really don't know.
What about technique? Did your reading get better as you did more of it? Was practice something that helped make perfect, do you think? And would practicing help these young individuals prepare themselves for this business more easily?
Yes, I think definitely there. But if you're going to do anything for 40 years, you hope you get better.
Good point.
Seriously, I feel so much more natural when I sit down doing it. It's just second nature to me now. Yeah, and I was much more self-conscious about what I was doing. And that's the first thing you don't want to do.
Tom Brady quits after 22.
Yeah.
Look at that.
I don't have 280-pound linebackers crunching me every other day either.
Listening to your voice, two phrases came to mind that I thought you could knock out. Either the shadow knows or you're a mean one, Mr. Grinch.
The shadow knows. Lamont Cranston. You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch.
There you go.
How's that?
Do you put yourself in a celebrity's mindset when crafting a voice for one of your characters?
Yes,
Do you really?
absolutely. That's my go-to as far as an identity to hang a hat on.
Yeah.
I pretty much cast all of my novels as I'm going. I don't know. They just always become somebody. And that's what helps me do the voices when they come back after 20 pages and this character shows up again. I remember usually they're character actors or somebody that you know from TV shows. They are this person. That's who I'm envisioning. So that makes it a lot easier to just keep a voice consistent, because if I was attempting to actually sound like that person, I would always be consistent in how I did it. So I'm doing the same thing with the character, and that's who's cast in the role. Same thing for the women. That's how I keep women's voices separate. You have older women and younger women, so that helps. There's one distinction right there. And then you have very refined women and you have a little harder edged women. That's another thing. You got something else going there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that all piles up. And at the end of the book, you have everybody cast. And the main guy is always me. I'm the star.
That's really fun. It's really fun listening to you talk about these characters and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. And there are so many things like that you can do. If you got this real sarcastic guy, you can do a Phil Silvers type thing, hey, and even though you may not change your voice to do it, the attitude that voice comes out in, that changes your voice.
And that's what I think the listeners, I want to say readers, but the listeners enjoy so much. The way you approach it, those subtleties is enough. It doesn't have to be over the top. It's just that subtle shifts. It's a page turner, keeps you going.
That's great. That is what they will tell you the first day you start doing this stuff is we're not looking for caricatures and doing voices. You're doing characters. They will sound different because they are different characters, but don't go over the top. And I think many of the people who are rejected, that's the stumbling block. And I took it to heart. I didn't know whether I was doing what they wanted, but apparently it worked because they took it. So I've just kind of gone with it since then and tried to think, okay, am I really doing something when I talk through my nose just a little bit to imply somebody else? Is that a caricature or is it just more of a hint? I guess I'm staying on the right side of that line, but it's always a question.
And I hear Braille readers, for example, say that they prefer reading Braille because it leaves the identity and the development of the character more to their imagination. It's more of a blank slate.
I can certainly understand that. I mean, I would much rather read a novel than see the movie it was based on, even if it's a really well done movie. And I think that's the reason I feel that way. I get to cast the whole thing. So I understand that. I certainly do.
I like reading books. I like seeing movies, but when I get something that's audio described, it's a whole nother genre in a sense. And then when I listen to ebooks and you're listening to synthetic voice, but when you're reading a book, Ray, I'm listening to the narrator too. So that's another area. I don't crisscross the two together or compare or anything. I have access to it and I like it. It's enjoyable. It's almost, I don't want to say go over the top theater. I mean, you're supposed to be unnoticeable because I'm taking in a book, but you help, keep me turning those pages because those subtleties, I'm not distracted
there you
by
go.
you.
Okay, well, that's good. That's when I'm doing my job correctly. But that's the thing. You don't want the narrator to be distracting, but that doesn't mean you want them to be a cipher, because the artificial intelligence voice is a cipher, and that is distracting.
Yeah.
You're constantly aware that this is not right. Whereas if you've got someone who does good inflections and good voices and everything, they do disappear into the work. I didn't mean to say that I would never listen to a book if I could read it with my eyes, because like I said earlier, the Dracula book that I did listen to, I enjoyed that immensely. But that brings up another benefit of the narrator style as opposed to just sitting and reading, which is that I listened to Dracula practically 98% in the dark, laying in bed. You can't read a book in the dark, laying in bed.
True that.
So, it's a whole different setting, and it served its own purpose.
What impresses me about you is, in light of what we've been talking about, you don't want to overdo the inflections or the dialect or whatever we're talking about with the types of voices. You don't want to go over the top. But yet, just yesterday, I read a conversation in a book with probably 6 characters talking in a group, 3 men, 3 women, and even with your subtlety, I could tell who was speaking without even knowing. Oftentimes the writer will say, Ray says, they'll identify who's speaking up front so you know who's about to speak. But often there's no identification of the character in the author's text. So I know who's speaking among these 3 women. I know it's Ruth versus Betty versus Janice. And it baffles me how you can hit the ground running and be able to move into the specific character's voice before the character's line even comes up in the dialogue or the conversation.
Boy, that's the thing any of us want to hear most, is that you can do that. That's great. Thank you.
Have you ever gotten negative feedback from listeners?
No, I have to say no. But at the same time... Well,
it just so happens, Ray, I got a couple of things. No, I'm kidding.
But when I say that, the feedback that we get from listeners, there's not a lot of it. There just really isn't. And I think that listeners, if they don't like your stuff, then they rightly don't listen to it and they move on. I've gotten a decent amount of feedback over the years, but it's always been positive. But I think that's because that's what moves people to give you feedback. At least it was in the old days. I mean, these days with social media and all that, first reaction to anything is, let's trash them on Twitter or whatever. It didn't used to be that easy, and most of the feedback I got was in the old days, when it would actually be a letter or maybe even a phone call. Somebody would call the printing house and leave a phone number and I'd call them and we'd talk. But, if they're going to go to that kind of trouble, it's probably because they liked me. If they didn't, they'd move on to somebody else who they did like, and they'd give them positive feedback.
I'm just glad you didn't say Pony Express or a telegram.
Not that old, but actually I did send a telegram one time in my life.
And those listeners who don't know what a telegram is, go study the Morse code and pay attention.
That's exactly right.
Stop.
Ray, do you encourage your listeners to reach out to you and share their thoughts?
I do. Nothing ever pleased me more on a given day than to get to the printing house, look in my mailbox, and see that there was a letter.
Sure. Do you want them to write to you email or what?
Email me directly, and I'll give you my email address. It's R Foushee, and you spell that Foushee 41 @gmail.com.
There you heard it, ladies and gentlemen.
The 401 is in recognition of Channel 41, which was the dial number of the TV station I worked at.
WDRB.
Right.
Cool. Any association with the AFB?
Oh, AFB, they used to award the Alexander Scourby Award, and I was fortunate enough to win that back in
1995.
That's right, 1995.
For nonfiction.
For nonfiction, yes. Anybody ever sends me to New York, I love them. My wife and daughter were with me, and we got to take in the whole thing. It was fun. That was a great time. It was really neat.
Oh, what a great experience.
Yes.
Ray, I really enjoyed listening to your passion.
Well, good.
I didn't know what it would be like because, you listen to a narrator, read books and stuff like that. The way you go about it and all that stuff, I like it. I like it a lot.
I, too, enjoyed it. Ray?
I like doing these interviews whenever I get a chance to do them, and it's fun to do. You guys are very good interviewers.
It's more of a chat, I think, with us. It occurs naturally.
Yeah, that's what's fun. Maybe that's the best answer for how I read. I just try to go with what comes naturally.
There you go.
Yeah, that's it.
One page after the other. Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey through it and your passion.
Absolutely.
Happy to do it always, really. And if you ever want to do it again, let me know. I'm ready.
The next time you retire from something else, we'll hit you up.
There you go. Although I'm running out of things to retire from.
Well, don't retire from reading talking books.
My plan is to do that until I die, seriously. And I wouldn't be the first to do that. I realize some of the people I listened to on the radio and watched on TV when I was a child, some of them went well into their 90s and continued to read there until literally they couldn't read anymore. And that was it. Something people do for their lives.
I assume you knew Mitzi Freelander?
Oh, absolutely. Mitzi was a great person. She really, really was. She has a studio named after her now at the printing house. Nice little plaque outside the studio that she usually always recorded in. And that's the Mitzi Freelander studio now.
Do you have a favorite studio, a regular studio?
I have a regular studio, yes. So maybe one day we'll have a plaque. Although right now, a lot of people read in that studio too. So I have competition.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Ray Foushee, thanks a million for chatting with us.
You're very welcome.
Well, thanks a lot, Ray.
Enjoy retirement, sir. This concludes our chat with Ray Foushee. We want to thank Ray for joining us in the Blind Abilities studio. You can read more about Ray Foushee and his work with the American Printing House for the Blind on their website, www.aph.org. And of course, listen to his selection of narrated titles from the National Library Service or on the Bard mobile app. And as usual, thanks to Chi Chow for his beautiful music. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.
When we share
what we see through
each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap
between the limited expectations and the realities of blind abilities.
The realities of blind abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities. Download our app from the App Store, Blind Abilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.